All right. It appears that we are live. Can I get a confirmation from Steve?
So much, Holly.
What's that?
Thank you so much for getting this going
Oh, sure thing.
tonight.
Okay.
We'll just give everybody a couple minutes to jump back on. I think we're waiting for Lisa Sharon Harper and Kimberly Knight to be joining us. We've got Anthony Smith here from Salisbury, North Carolina. Chris Crass, the author of the new book, Towards Collective Liberation, coming to us from the Knoxville, Tennessee area. And Scott Bostic from Wesley Seminary, but currently somewhere in Indiana or something.
Close enough.
And, of course, Holly Roach, Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Kimberly Knight will be joining us from Atlanta. There she is. Hey, Kimberly. Thank you for joining us. We are live on YouTube. And we're just waiting now for Lisa Sharon Harper to join us on the Hangout. And then we'll get started. Scott is playing with Google Hangout.
Sorry, I'm done.
That's Anthony. My lower third is not cooperating.
Your upper third looks great.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So we'll just, let's just wait another minute or so here and see if Lisa can rejoin us. We had her on earlier and we had to restart the Hangout. As is the case with this new technology, it doesn't always work perfectly, and it wasn't letting us live stream the earlier Hangouts. We had to close out and start a new Hangout, and so far so good. Things seem to be looking good so far on this one.
Are we really live? I'm hearing that we're not.
I'm checking it out on YouTube right now.
Okay, great.
Yes, we are live. So.
Great. Hello, everybody.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks for coming. I might need
It
to.
doesn't always work perfectly, and it wasn't letting us live stream the earlier Hangouts. We had to close out and start a new Hangout. Do you need? Let's see here. So far, so good. Try one more thing here.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
We may need to forward that link to.
Are we really live?
Okay. Yep. I just sent it to her.
Okay. Great.
Okay, great.
Okay, so now Lisa Sharon Harper should have the new link. There she is.
Great. Hello, everybody.
Yeah.
Hey, Lisa, welcome back.
Thanks for coming. I might need
It
to.
doesn't always work perfectly, and it wasn't letting us live stream the earlier Hangouts. We had to close out. You need.
I am
Hey,
hearing.
guys. People who have their camera thing on, can you turn that camera thing off?
Yep. I just sent it to her. And if any of you have the live stream going, could you mute it? Because I'm hearing it coming through.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so there we go. All right. We're all here. Yes. thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks for enduring some of the little technical difficulties and things. Thank you to Holly Roach for helping to organize this and get Chris Crass here with us to talk about his book. And I did a little quick introduction earlier, but let's just go through and each introduce ourselves for the folks out there who are watching the live stream. I'll start, and then maybe we can go left to right. Are little pictures at the bottom in the same order? I don't even know. Whatever. We'll figure it out. I'm Steve Knight. I am co-founder and co-CEO of Sogo Media, sogomedia.tv, a new kind of Christian television network on YouTube. And I'm here in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, and that's where I'm live streaming from tonight, and glad to be here. Anthony, why don't you go next?
Okay. I'm Anthony Smith. I'm from Salisbury, North Carolina. I'm one of the co-hosts of Mission House, which is a Kingdom of God experiment in Salisbury, or another description would be a missional community, predominantly African-American community. Also blog under the moniker Postmodern Negro for a number of years. And just glad to be here, part of this conversation, and I look forward to see the fruit of this.
All right.
Chris.
My name is Chris Crass, and I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I lived for a long time. I grew up in California and did a lot of my organizing on the West Coast and moved to Tennessee to help build up my new family. I've got a 2-year-old who's on his way to bedtime right now, and just recently published my book, Towards Collective Liberation, and I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation with you all.
Yay, my name is Holly Roach. I'm an activist organizer in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and really excited to be in this conversation with you guys. Really happy to see Chris again. It's been a long time, but really looking forward to talking again. So thanks.
I am Kimberly Knight, and I am in Atlanta, and I am currently serving as a director of digital strategy at Liberal Arts Women's College in the area, and I have worked with the Beatitude Society as an online organizer around social justice issues and training clergy and emerging seminarians around organization for social justice issues. And then went to work for the Center for Progressive Renewal for a while in a similar capacity. And I'm a blogger. My blog is Coming Out Christian, where I explore the intersection of being gay and Christian in America, especially in the South.
Awesome.
Hi, my name is Lisa Sharon Harper, and I am the Director of Mobilizing at Sojourners, also the author of Evangelical Does Not Equal Republican or Democrat. And also the author of a newer book called Left, Right, and Christ, Evangelical Faith in Politics. And the books really go into and explore what is the nature of what it means to be evangelical if it's not a moniker that is politically defined. And that's the first book. And then the second one is really explores two different perspectives on different political issues from people who both call themselves evangelical.
Cool.
Hi, I'm Scott Bostic. I'm a seminary student and a missional church fellow at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and tonight I am broadcasting from Culver Military Academy in Culver, Indiana, which is about an hour south of South Bend, Indiana.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you again all for being with us here in this conversation specifically focused around this exciting new book, Towards Collective Liberation by Chris Crass, Anti-Racist Organizing, Feminist Praxis and Movement Building Strategy. And a number of us are reading this book. Some of us are finished reading it, and are really excited to get a chance to engage with you, Chris, around the themes and the topics that are in this book. for folks who haven't read it yet, tell us about the book. How did the book come together, and kind of what is your vision for this book?
Yeah. Well, the book is primarily reflections on my own personal organizing over the past 25 years, most of that time having been in different activist organizations, as well as looking to some key groups doing anti-racist work, specifically in white communities, which is one of the themes that I explore in the book. And so really, the main goal is trying to share lessons, insights, stories from mistakes and successes with other activists. And just for myself, I mean, when I first became really politicized and engaged, I was 15 and in the suburbs of Los Angeles, and I was just so hungry to read about social justice history and theory, but I was really into reading about people's lives and how they actually put this into practice in social struggles and their personal lives and their communities. And so really wanting to pass on those kinds of lessons from my own experience as a way of engaging in dialogue with other activists around, how can we build relevant, visionary, dynamic left social justice politics that speak to us today and can really help move us forward. And so, for myself, coming up mostly a lot of my activism in the 90s and in the 2000s, trying to pass on some of those lessons from particularly anarchist organizing in the 90s, economic justice organizing in the 90s, and then anti-racist work in the 2000s with feminism being a major theme running through all of that political work. So the primary purpose of the book, again, is just to kind of get into this question of, okay, a lot of us have good ideas about what we're trying to do, and we have our practice, but really trying to reflect on, okay, when stuff actually gets, from the gray area between theory and practice of what does this really look like in the world, and it's often wonderfully, beautifully complicated and challenging, but we need to get into that to draw the real lessons to help us move forward.
I'll ask one more question and then invite other folks to jump in. I understand from our earlier conversations that you're a Unitarian Universalist, and you have a specific interest in getting this book into the hands of faith organizers, religious groups that are engaged in social justice. Tell us about that. What's your passion and interest around engaging with groups of faith leaders like those of us here tonight?
Yeah, I mean, when Holly first told me about emergent Christian work and the work that you all are doing as a movement and as a network, I was just really excited because again, growing up, I was really most of my growing up in my teenage years coming into activism, I was in Orange County, which is in Southern California and a real hotbed of conservative Christian grassroots reactionary organizing. And so a lot of my exposure to faith-based political work was right-wing, was extremely homophobic and sexist, and I really rejected that as a young person, but that's really all I saw in terms of a real a spiritual faith community was really rooted in the right wing. And so over the years, as I came into contact with Catholic workers and progressive Christians and radical Jews and progressive Muslims and just different people of faith, it was just incredibly inspiring because I think that spirituality is such a powerful part of our existence and who we are as people and our search for meaning and roots and groundedness and ancestors and tradition. And so to feel that spirituality is something that can live and breathe and thrive amongst feminist and queer liberation politics and social justice politics was just very important for me. And so I came to Unitarian Universalism through my organizing work, where I was invited to support their efforts around anti-racism, in particular as a majority white faith. And part of that was helping them move their faith and their values into organized action. And so part of it was doing political education around anti-racism and consciousness around white supremacy and white privilege, but part of it also was supporting their own leaders and organizing confidence to engage in the world and bring their spirituality, bring their faith into the streets, into society, to move our values of social justice forward. And in the process, I was primarily working with the young people, the teenagers of the Unitarian Universalists, and I was so impressed with all these young people who were having these really meaningful conversations about, justice and privilege and power, and then having these beautiful rituals at night that really were celebrating their humanity and their connection to the earth and to God. And so it was for me, it was an organizing opportunity, but in the process, I found a spiritual home where my own Christian background could be connected to a larger faith community, really drawing lessons and insights from all faith traditions. So it was powerful. And then out of that, I've had a real passion around building up spiritual and social justice left politics that can speak to young people, that can speak to folks about what is our deeper meaning, our deeper connection to the earth, to one another, to our ancestors, and to the divine.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, Chris, I was kind of curious to maybe go through the title of the book with you a little bit and unpack some of these amazing words that you have used. So what are you talking about when you're talking about collective liberation, and where does that come from for you? And I've heard you say liberation politics, and just curious if that has anything to do with liberation theology.
Well, it did kind of indirectly through women of color feminism, where Bell Hooks was really talking a lot about liberation theology, and I was really connecting to women of color feminism. And then some of them, Bell Hooks in particular, others, Gloria Anzaldúa, talking about spirituality. And so my search and really looking into women of color feminism came from my own experience of being a young person, being white, being a second generation middle class, being male. And at first, the first couple years of my political work, it was primarily what are these systems that we're up against, and really seeing this injustice in the world in terms of capitalism, in terms of inequality, and really being like, okay, what are the things out there in the world that we need to work against? And in that process of being part of social justice efforts and organizations, issues around internal dynamics around sexism and racism, and ways that I had internalized a lot of the ideas of white supremacy and patriarchy really became at the forefront as a result primarily of women and people of color in my life talking with me, sharing experiences from their own lives, and pushing me, encouraging me to learn more. And so out of that, I really started looking towards organizing in communities of color and organizing in working class communities, and feminist organizing in women of color feminism was a powerful thread throughout all of that. And so collective liberation came specifically from an incredible essay by Bell Hooks called "Love is the Practice of Freedom" in her book Outlaw Woman, and or not Outlaw Woman, Outlaw Culture, I'm sorry. But she talks about not only the importance of love in progressive movements, and she really talks a lot about love and spirituality, but she talked about the interconnections of systems of oppression. And so for myself, as somebody who had a lot of being in a more of a privileged relationship to systems of oppression, I started thinking more about, okay, what is a politics that can speak to me and other white people and other men in a way that can bring more of us into working against systems of oppression. And I was thinking about, okay, well, if systems of oppression are interconnected, systems of liberation are also interconnected. And so the systems of liberation that women of color feminism in particular talk about is, as we work against sexism, as we work against racism, as we work against capitalism, we're creating a society that can benefit all of us. And so I wanted to think about how can I really try to work with other white people, work with other men in a way that isn't just about like, hey, we need to really be conscious of these things that can be oppressive and perpetuating harmful practices, but how can we, as talking to other white people and other men, talk about proactive, positive things that we can do in the world to help further these shared visions and politics. So collective liberation is both a vision of a liberated society for all people, but it's also about how can we align and bring unity between people who are positioned in privileged places and oppressed positions within the way that society is organized, systems of oppression, and build real, genuine, meaningful unity and meaningful relationships around shared values where, yeah, this history, these institutions, these systems of power are real. We can't just, all come together and say that we're on the same page politically and they disappear. These are real, material, historical forces that impact and shape our lives in a powerful way. But with a vision of coming together, not in a false unity of just we're all together, we're all human, one race, but in a real recognition of different relationships to power and privilege and oppression, we can become conscious and also work to build those bridges rather than have all of these different issues divide us. So collective liberation is primarily about how can we turn these divisions that usually tear us apart as progressives, as people who want social justice, how can we turn those divisions into bridges and catalysts to help us get to where we want to go?
Amen. Anybody have any responses to that or questions around that?
Well, I think this is Lisa Sharon Harper from Sojourners. I'm actually really intrigued because I began my work as an organizer in New York City around the issue of environmental injustice. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we experienced in our goal was actually to bring together churches in the city that it was an ecumenical, actually interfaith movement, but it was really, one of the goals was to bring together the privileged with those who have been dumped on, literally, in terms of toxins in the city. And it was an amazing experience that continues to this day, even beyond my time in New York City. We started this thing called Faith Leaders for Environmental Justice, and every single quarter they came together without missing a beat to learn more about what are the different ways that our systems, the way that things work in our city, are causing higher levels of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and other ailments, including death, among people of color who are poor especially. And what we found was that for evangelicals in particular, that was a hard bridge to cross, because not only did you have to cross the bridge of affluence, and race, but you also had to cross the theological bridge that evangelicals didn't cross for most of the 20th century, that left them not engaging, just completely disengaged from public life, except for on a few issues starting in the 1980s. But even before then, they disengaged, since the 1920s. So, but through the organizing process, one-on-ones, and just modeling what does it look like to be an evangelical and engaged in public square, we really began to see some progress, and we began to kind of change the narrative in New York City. And I think we're beginning to see that more on a national level at Sojourners. I mean, not more. They've been seeing it for a long time. I'm seeing it more now that I'm at Sojourners on a national level. I think particularly with the issue of immigration, with the engagement of the evangelical immigration table there. So here's my question with that large frame. My question is, when you talk about feminist engagement or anti-racist engagement, what specifically do you mean? What does it mean to be an anti-racist organizer or movement builder? Does it mean that you are working towards the good of people of color? Does it mean that you are working in partnership with people of color and women, or does it mean you're being led by people of color, or all of the above?
Well, I think all of the above, given the different circumstances you find yourself in. First of all, it's fantastic that that's going on in New York City, and it's beautiful to hear about different examples of people being able to come together and form coalitions or alliances based on shared values that lasts over time. And I think one of the things about both anti-racist and feminist work, particularly trying to organize people who, and again, when I talk about people who have access to privilege, I'm talking about material privileges in terms of housing, education, engagement with the criminal justice system, to historically different kind of legal privileges that white people or that men have had, as well as cultural norms and kind of internalized psychological privileges that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, the wages of whiteness back in the early 1900s as being one of the main things given to poor and working class white people, not poor and working class white people having access to good housing, good education, but living in horrible conditions, but feeling the psychological superiority to particularly black people and people of color as the benefit of being white. And so it's not to take away from the reality that there are people who have real power in society in terms of being able to make decisions that impact all of our lives. So I don't want to get into this thing where it's just people who have access to some privilege and then people who experience oppression, and then completely ignore the fact that there's a real power in society in terms of the state, in terms of corporations, in terms of these different institutions that impact our lives. But in terms of anti-racist work and feminist work, a lot of that came from just my experience of organizing. And so I was doing immigrant rights work in Southern California, and it was on a working class community college, multiracial community college in at Fullerton in Orange County. And at first, it was this really beautiful multiracial coalition working around student fee hikes, and everyone loved us. I mean, all the students loved us, the teachers loved us, the student newspaper loved us because we were this working against student fee hikes and all this money going into the prison system and out of the public education system. Well, the next semester, and it was this really incredible coalition of Chicano nationalists from MECHA and the Black Student Union and the newly formed Gay Student Union, and then there was a crew of us who were mostly white, anarchist, social justice activists who were also part of the coalition. Well, the next semester, we decided to focus on ethnic studies, and this was coming from one of the leaders of MECHA, this guy David Rojas, who was a real mentor. He was like, okay, next semester we're going to focus on more education for the people of this school to learn their history, to learn, but also for everyone to learn a broader history, not just this very narrow history of this country. And so in preparation, we all got together over the summer and read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. So we launched into our campaign the next semester. Well, our support quickly dwindles. All kinds of white students are saying that we're now advocating for special rights, that we're, in some instances, even saying that we're advocating for hate classes that teach students of color to hate white people. The student newspaper denounced us as having abandoned the students and being gone over onto this. So it was just this incredible experience. It was a horrible experience, but it was profoundly educational for me because I was just like, kind of like, why, like, oh my, I mean, I figured it was going to be a challenge, but I was surprised with how quickly we lost so much support. Well, the two white students who spoke at one of our rallies, myself and another white person, ended up being called into the dean of students' office and threatened with expulsion. Basically we were said, okay, they said the janitor who had identified us from pictures in the school newspaper at this rally as having done vandalism at the school, and so now we were going to be expelled. We were going to be arrested at some point in the future in one of our classes. All of our previous credits would be made would be eliminated. We couldn't take them to another school. And then we're like, okay, so you leave now, but at some point this week you will be arrested. And there was like 2 police officers sitting next to me during this thing. I was like, oh my God. I was scared out of my mind. So I go and I find David Rojas, and he's like, this is what's going on. They are so scared of us coming together. They're going after the white people, and they want to pull the white people away so they can just say it's just a bunch of these angry Chicanos and some angry black students, and this issue is going to go away, and they can marginalize us even further. And he was like, you know what? We got to stick together and we got to fight. And the one thing we need to do is we need you and a couple other people who are committed to this coalition to start organizing the white people, because we're organizing in the Latino community. The Black Student Union is organizing in the Black community on campus, but we don't have anyone who's specifically thinking about organizing the white people. And white people need to understand why ethnic studies, why Chicano studies, why all what we're talking about is so important, not just for us, but for them. And so you need to figure out how to communicate with white people, because white people, I mean, you know, and he was like, you know this, because I was taking all these classes too. I was taking all these classes. And he's like, you need to explain to more white people why you're taking these classes, why you think they're important, and you need to build support for ethnic studies in the white community. And so I was like, all right, okay, well, what do I do? How do you do that? But it was an experiment, and then trying to do that. And then pretty soon, all these ads started appearing. This was in the early mid-90s. All these ads started appearing in our student papers saying, illegal immigrants are stealing your education. Illegal aliens are stealing your education by coming in, taking all of the classes, and raising tuition. So quickly we were fighting for ethnic studies, and all of a sudden these right-wing groups started putting in these like horrible ads attacking immigrant and just Latino students. And so at the same time, it's like, okay, we got to try to stick together. We got to try to build this thing. And all these kind of experiments with trying to organize white students started happening. And I saw how important it was. And so over the years of doing that more and more and more, and then, eventually women also talking to me about, like, you know what, like, more men need to step up and start not only encouraging other men about looking at sexism and looking at male privilege, but need to encourage more and more men to provide leadership in doing feminist work. That it's not just women alone. So basically, those experiences of just doing organizing and then having different people encourage me to start looking at how can you bring more, and not just like, okay, let's get a handful of white people who get it, but actually let's try to organize hundreds and thousands and hundreds of thousands of white people to join in multiracial struggles for economic and racial justice, as well as trying to organize large numbers of men, not just like me and my 3 friends who are like, okay, we get together and read bell hooks and can feel really are excited about that, but how can we get more and more men to where that becomes more and more of a norm, that that men in social justice work are being mentored and supported by other men to develop feminist consciousness, feminist politics, as that's just what we do. That's how we're going to win. That's how we're going to be more effective. That's how we're going to live healthier, more dynamic lives. So the anti-racist feminist work both is about looking to leadership of folks of color and women, as well as trying to really think about, not how do you guilt and shame white people or men into this work, but how can I and many others speak to white people and men from a place of, you know what, this is critical for our health, for our spiritual lives, for our souls, for our communities, for our families, and this is why, and this is how we can get involved and really work for change.
So I'm sorry, I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
This is so rich. This is so awesome. Okay, so back in January, we had a gathering of environmental leaders in the evangelical world. And it was powerful. I mean, you had a lot of the major movers, organizations, not just individuals, but organizations represented at this gathering of what is now becoming known as the web, an evangelical web of environmental or creation care advocates that are really focused on moving the evangelical community in its understanding of climate change, actually. So we might be able to make some progress there. As a part of the group, as part of the strategy, and also as a necessary component of the strategy, we made sure that there was a significant group of environmental justice advocates who were part of that gathering. Environmental justice, for those who don't know, are the folks who are the ones getting dumped on. I mean, it's basically the people who get the dumped on the most and the first. People of color who are poor, generally speaking. And so they were there in the room, or organizations that represent those communities. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that really struck me the most in that gathering, so this is a gathering that's very white and very male, except for a few white women, and then you had your environmental justice people. But one of the moments that struck me the most was when we had to gather a smaller contingent of the group that began to ask the question of how do we form? It's our first meeting. How are we going to actually do this? And in the very beginning, Jim Wallace, who was there, he said, you know, so often we leave it to people of color to be the ones who have to fight for themselves. But I want to raise this question right now. How are we going to make the issues that concern people of color come to the center and to help guide the action that we take in this climate change group, in this climate change web? And I mean, a woman who was in the circle, she's wonderful. Her name is Dr. Charlotte Keyes from Mississippi, an African-American woman who herself has had dumping on her grounds, and she's been a major advocate for over a decade there. She started to tell her story, and as she told her story of the ways that typically the climate change community really has not listened to the stories of people of color, and it really has, and particularly the evangelical one has been led by white men who have not actually done, generally speaking, usually listened to those stories and responded. As she told her story, people around that circle began to weep. And it struck me that white men do have a significant role to play, significant, because white men listen to white men, generally speaking, right? That's pretty much, if it ain't being said by a white man, generally speaking, it's not going to be heard, at least not for a while. So there's a very significant role to be played by white men who will speak up, sometimes on behalf of, but I believe often in partnership with people of color and women. But here's the problematic. So the question becomes, but when is it appropriate, or how do women and people of color get to talk for ourselves in that equation? And how do we gain our own voice and our own platform? And when? I mean, you know, so I think that's because there's a whole nother, it's funny, it's a weird thing, right? Because you can have white men who are actually being anti-racist and feminist and speaking out and leading other white men. But what I've often heard, and I believe is true, is that until a white man comes under the leadership of a person of color or a woman, then ultimately all the stuff that's kind of been ingrained in that white male psyche for all of his growing up in America, in particular North America or the West, it doesn't have a chance to kind of get dislodged and reorganized until that happens. So how do you as a white man work that out for yourself?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, just with earlier with what you were talking about, I mean, I had multiple experiences, and this was, again, when I was a teenager, of being in situations, you know, after the Rodney King verdict, being with, you know, a friend of mine, Terrence, you know, African American, and he and I being in discussions with white folks about the Rodney King verdict, and him talking about his analysis of the Rodney King verdict and his own experiences of police brutality and racism, and over and over and over again, white people being like, well, you know, you're just bringing the race card into this. You know, you can't see, you know, you can't see past your own race. You know, you can't, you know. And then there'd be times where unknowingly, you know, I would then jump into the conversation and be so frustrated and just basically try to argue the same points that he just made, and they'd be like, well, okay, I can see what you're saying. You know, like, well, because you're not, and they'd say, well, because you're not biased. You know, you're not biased, and so if you're saying that police brutality is a real issue, then, well, maybe it is. And so I had that experience over and over again. That's right. It was very important because my friend Terrence, who, you know, was a mentor for me, you know, would pull me aside after experiences like that and be like, you know, that I'm the one that was saying all those things, and you're being able to then just back me up made a big change.
That's right.
But if you don't say something in those conversations that affirms that, hey, you know what, Terrence was just saying that 5 minutes ago, and you know, you didn't listen to him. That we could come out of that conversation where I'm the one that appears very smart and very knowledgeable, And Terrence leaves extremely frustrated, not only because these folks weren't listening, but now all of his ideas are seen as my ideas. And this happened over and over again with women in our organizations, and where similar kinds of things would happen. And so the key was being able to, Terrence, was really clear. He was like, you know what, in those situations, to have my back, you need to be able to both affirm my leadership and bring your leadership. It's not a scarcity thing. We need both of our leadership in this situation. So we don't, you don't need to be a wallflower and try to disappear to help me have more space.
That's right.
You need to take some space that opens up some space for me. So take space to open space, and then I'll take space to open space as well. And together we can transform some spaces and move some things forward. And so, we would talk about, okay, how can we do that in ways that is supportive and trying to undermine some of these dynamics in this power relationship, recognizing that there are times when I'm going to say something and it's going to be heard in a particular way that's going to move things forward. But if I don't also acknowledge what's going on, then I can move forward and then step back 2 places. And so, this dynamic is like, yeah, okay, leadership needs to be taken in different places, but leadership of other folks also needs to be recognized, appreciated, and lifted up. And so, the importance of folks of color and women in my life is unbelievable. And I really try, throughout the book and in my life, my political education work, to really try to lift that up and point people towards different leaders who have been important in my life. And so, going and taking ethnic studies classes and having, black professors, professors of color, women professors who were really, and I saw that as me really looking to their leadership to guide my education and help and challenge me and push me and help show me ways that I could grow, as well as looking to mentors, both, white anti-racist and feminist white women, but also mentors of color and organizers of color to really learn from and grow with. And I think it's a dynamic relationship that grows over time of both looking to leadership and also over time developing trust and building relationships where then you're also sharing leadership and building alliances. But it's a process, it's a relationship, it's a dynamic, and also things change over time. It's not static. Power is not something that just is. We're not talking about like 1 + 1 = 2. We're talking about 1 plus 1 = 2 for now. But when we start bringing in more people, we can change up that equation, and power starts to change. And so one of the things that's really important is not that we get stuck in just trying to like intellectually talk about all this stuff, but people in motion. And I would assume in your New York experience that when people hear stories, when people learn about each other's lives, and when people take action together and feel what it's like to move together, that it changes things. Dynamics change. And so it's not a thing of having a static relationship of, okay, well, my relationship to you is like this, and this is how power works. Yes, there are real static, in terms of systems of oppression in the history. We can't change the history, but we can create a future together and do that in a way that's respectful and do that in a way that honors that it's a process. That, and for a lot of white folks and for a lot of men, there's this sense of entitlement of just being able to show up and have whatever relationship you want with whoever you want, and not being able to recognize that there's a lot of work that needs to go into building relationships and a lot of humility and really being able to learn from other folks. And so for me, I spent about 7 years primarily just, in ethnic studies classes and women's studies classes with the goal of trying to use that to work in white communities and work with men, and not, and again, to help bring those folks into relationship with communities of color and with women of color feminism and feminist movement, as a way of honoring and trying to bring more people into alignment with that leadership, because that leadership exists. We're not, there's a need for more leadership, but there's also tremendous leadership in our society. And what we need is to be building more and more momentum around that leadership to help move us forward. And in the process, more and more leaders will develop.
Well, Anthony Smith, I have a question. I was intrigued by when you guys did the mass action in Seattle in '99, when you wrote about this. I found a corollary between what you saw with anarchism and also what we're seeing now with progressive Christian movements. How you guys back in '99 came to an awareness that, hey, this is white male dominated, right? There's something that took place there. And I'm intrigued by that because many of us are part of conversation and movements, maybe on a local level that may be diverse, but nationally or possibly globally are pretty much still white male dominated. But I'm intrigued in particular if you can unpack that story a little bit, like what was a catalyst for that in '99?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in '99, I mean, I think the Seattle WTO demonstrations, the World Trade Organization, incredibly undemocratic, very powerful corporation or institutional organization to help facilitate corporations to have access to the resources, to workers all over the world. And so really the momentum around protesting the World Trade Organization came from movements in the Global South, the Zapatistas, movements in Brazil and in India, who had been calling for international protests against the World Trade Organization. So it was a dynamic started to develop where in the United States, it was kind of majority white, economic justice, kind of anarchist radical activists really looking to leadership in the Global South, forming relationships in the Global South, but not making the connection to struggles in their own local communities, particularly communities of color and working class communities of color. And so having, a lot of us having a real sense of solidarity with movements in other parts of the world, but not really having much connection with social justice movements and communities of color in the United States. And so what was really powerful with the WTO was that after years and years of a lot of different kinds of powerful, meaningful organizing, this convergence of different groups came together, and it was powerful. I mean, it was an incredibly effective demonstration that had international impact. But I think one of the things that was interesting about it was that it highlighted the strengths that we'd had at that point, but then a lot of our weaknesses came to the forefront. And so for myself, I saw this as and particularly having, I was very lucky at that time because I had a bunch of mentors with me at that time who, 60s and 70s movement mentors who were like, these are the moments when you can see what's going on in the movement, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, and where things can go next. And one of those mentors was Elizabeth Petita Martinez, who wrote this essay, Where Was the Color in Seattle? And so this essay circulated everywhere. I mean, it became the essay that literally tens of thousands of activists, mostly white activists, were reading this. And it was incredible. And it was incredible because it was like, okay, this is this woman, she's an elder. She's, been in social justice movements since the 50s, was heavily involved in multiracial movement building for many years, and had been supporting me and other folks around anti-racist work in white communities. And so what she said was, you know what, this essay has been more read and commented on than any other thing that I've ever written. And it shows that there's an absolute hunger amongst activists to try to figure out what's going on and what can we do. And so one of the things that we tried to do in that moment was that there was all this momentum and positive momentum of having accomplished something incredible in Seattle and having a real impact. And so what we tried to do was talk about anti-racism and feminism as a next step to help us grow. And so we try to talk about it as this is part of building the momentum, is we need to address these issues to help us continue to grow. So we didn't say like, oh, okay, actually none of those victories actually are meaningful. We actually weren't successful. It was seeing that historically this is how stuff works. We build to a certain point, we get our strength, we get, certain places, and then we converge, and then it's just like, oh my God, we got a whole lot more work to do. But right. It's important to recognize that a lot of positive work has gone into things building up to this point so that we don't tear all of what we already have down. We actually think, okay, well, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, and then really trying to talk to in this case, myself and a number of other people formed a group called Catalyst Project. And the idea was that anti-racism is a catalyst to build our movements. And so really trying to frame anti-racism not as this like, oh my God, all the white people are scared out of their minds that they're going to be called racist. And, everyone is like, duck and cover, but more of like, all right, you know what? We're taking on some real systems of oppression. We're taking on some real issues, and this is the next step. So let's roll up our sleeves and let's go for it, because what's happening right now is historic. Right now, our different movements are in communication. Right now, people of color organizations were reading that essay as well. White groups were reading that essay as well, and so a conversation began to happen between different movements that hadn't happened before in a generation. But a lot of complicated dynamics were happening because a lot of people were like, oh my, a lot of the folks of color who were coming into mostly white spaces were like, oh my God, these white folks are not even thinking about these issues that are impacting our lives. There's a lot of cultural differences. There's a lot of different kind of unseen power dynamics. A lot of, for a lot of the white activists, there was a lot of like, insecurity and fear, or becoming really defensive and angry about, different challenges being made. And so the role that we tried to play was, how can we continually try to look at this conflict as a positive space to move us forward and deepen our relationships, deepen trust by engaging in the conflict? Because it's not like the conflict wasn't there before. It was just much more under the surface, or just different groups weren't working together, or just didn't even know, just weren't engaging at all. And so when people start coming together, there's going to be conflict. And so what we are trying to say is that with anti-racism and with feminist work, the conflict doesn't signal that something bad is happening. It actually signals that we're doing something really powerful that can transform, that can transform who we were before, carry our strengths, carry our traditions, carry what's positive with us. But we're going to go through something where we're going to become something different and something more in line with our values than where we were before. But we need to be ready to let go of some stuff, to learn some stuff, and bring some stuff with us. We're not, leaving it all behind, but to try to engage in this moment of conflict as a moment of powerful learning, transformation, and growth. But one of the things that's so important in that kind of experience is leadership and historical grounding, to know that we've gone through these kinds of things before. We can move through them. Like today I was just driving through a storm, and it's like knowing that I would eventually get past this storm into the sunshine again was incredibly helpful when these like sheets of rain were covering my windshield and I couldn't see where I was going. So knowing that we can get through the storm, knowing that sunshine is going to come when we pass through this storm, and is very important. And so with the WTO, it was incredible. It was incredible. I mean, literally, tens of thousands of, mostly white activists, groups were hungry for anti-racist political education, reading about organizing in communities of color, asking Elizabeth Batista Martinez and others to come speak all over the country to their groups and their conferences. And so one of the things critically, again, going back to an earlier point, so the Catalyst Project is a white anti-racist group. One of the things that we continually did was we would be the folks that would go and do an anti-racist training with a all-white group or a mostly white group. But we would lift up organizations of color, leaders of color, who we were in relationship to, who we were learning from, to, for example, United Students Against Sweatshops. We helped facilitate their organization, which, hundreds of student chapters all over the country, forming stronger relationships with locally based, immigrant-led organizing going on in their communities, in communities of color, immigrant communities of color in the U.S. Because most of their work before was more international, supporting the ending of sweatshops around the world. And so a lot of anti-sweatshop activists of color in the U.S. were talking to us, and we're like, you know what? How can we help get these students to work on our campaigns? And so, we literally brought in a book that had just been published called Sweatshop Warriors, that talked about all of their organizing, and we distributed it to United Students Against Sweatshops after doing this training. And literally 6 months later, these relationships were being formed. Campaigns, the students were joining in campaigns of local organizations of color. And so we were trying to help facilitate those kinds of processes. But the WTO moment, and I think the moment potentially that you all are in, is a moment where a lot of people are paying attention, and a lot of people are looking for direction and looking for inspiration and insights about where to go. And so to think of this as an opportunity to move forward, as opposed to like, oh my God, this is a really scary moment that's going to tear us all apart. It could tear us apart, or tear you all apart, but it could also be something that brings you together in a way that you've never been before.
Man, that's helpful on so many levels, man. Thank you.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
But leadership is so important. I mean, leadership to help move that forward, both of color and white folks, leadership to help move people forward and not have people just swim in the chaos of what's going on, but see that chaos as something that's destroying old negative patterns, but leadership and history and those lessons from the past helping us to construct positive liberatory dynamics moving forward.
That's great, Chris. One of our viewers is chatting in a question or kind of a comment, and I think it might be a good place for it. He's saying, oh shoot, I just lost it. He says that his fear is that a lot of activism tends to be Washington, D.C. focused and about forming very broad coalitions. He's saying that, in his opinion, our winner-take-all electoral system makes it so we get too much hierarchy and not enough sharing. So how, we're talking about leadership. How do we develop leadership that is, particularly with folks who are not working professionally as organizers, they're not working for NGOs, they're not, in the electoral system. How does that happen? How do movements intentionally develop this leadership that's so crucial that you're talking about?
Yeah. I mean, one of the people I really look to for a lot of inspiration and guidance around thinking about leadership is Ella Baker, who's a longtime civil rights movement organizer, and one of the chapters in the book is specifically about her. And at the time, I was in a Black Studies class and just really, searching for the question. I mean, basically the question that you're raising, I was, having that question for myself around, how can we create democratic leadership and not just this repeating the same old kind of authoritarian models. And Ella Baker, who, spent decades organizing primarily in the South, but around the country, one of her goals was really to help build up local organizations and local leaders and build networks that could bring those people into relationship with one another, so that when the civil rights movement, after the Montgomery bus boycott happened, when things were really taking off, she was in relationship to local leaders all over the South and had been supporting these organizations. And her and a number of other people, Bayard Rustin being one of them, an incredible gay civil rights organizer, they were looking for this kind of spark moment of the Montgomery bus boycott to help unify and bring together these local leaders and local organizations. And so they helped to do that. But one of the things around leadership is that she talked about the importance of finding roles for lots of different people to play, lots of different ways that people can participate. And so sometimes in activism it can be like, okay, this is what you do. You either you're a full-time organizer, or you're a public speaker and you're doing all these kinds of things. But a lot of it is sort of some things that only a very small number of people are likely going to be able to do. A lot of us, have families and other commitments in our community, and so Ella Baker really stressed. I mean, this was in the 50s and the 60s. She really stressed the importance of building organizations and campaigns where lots and lots of people could play roles, and that one of the responsibilities of a leader and an organizer is to recognize and see the special talents, the passions, the joys, and support all of these different people to plug into these different roles and use their participation as a way to help them come more fully into their own power. And so sometimes as organizers we can get really kind of task oriented with our to-do list, and there's all these different things that need to be done. But really, as organizers, we also need to remember, and as leaders, faith leaders, social justice leaders, that one of our primary tasks and roles is to help create opportunities for people to come into their own power, for opportunities for people to come into bring their own shine, their own beauty, their own light into the world. And so whether that's through encouraging people to participate in demonstrations, facilitate a meeting that they've never done before, whether that's encouraging someone to speak at a rally, whether that's encouraging someone to lead a song in church, whatever it is, looking for opportunities for people to come more into their power and develop their leadership. Because leadership is about skills and about experience, but it's also about confidence. And for a lot of people in this society, particularly for women, for folks of color, for working class folks, for queer and trans people, there's so many messages about you have no leadership, you have nothing to contribute, you have no, your people have no history, no contributions, all of these kinds of messages, and so, I often talk about this really incredible quote from Stephen Biko, a South African, anti-apartheid leader, who talked about the most powerful weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And so when you talk about the mind of the, because, if oppressed people can buy into, and not only buy into, but actively support the logic of a society that oppresses them and support the system, support the culture, support the logic of this society, then oppressed people are going to fight each other and fight to defend that system. And so you don't even need to worry about oppressed people being able to come together and organize to transform things. And so part of leadership development that Ella Baker and many others have talked about is giving people opportunities to believe in themselves in a way that counters these messages and these ideas and changes how people relate to power and how people relate to their own place in society. And so being able to, if the most powerful weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, then the most powerful weapon, or the most powerful force for liberation is, again, the minds of the oppressed, minds of oppressed people believing in their capacity to create a different society. And so part of our goal then is to help people have opportunities to believe in themselves, to experience their own power, and to be able to change not only what's going on in their minds, but their relationships with other people. And again, that's why it's so important to move people into action and have people in relationship to each other so that those relationships can start to transform into something positive. And again, for leaders and organizers, our job is to help create those spaces, help create those opportunities, and encourage people to take risks, to step up, and to bring themselves, or in some cases, to step back, but to encourage spaces where people can step into their power and then bring their own leadership that, then I and others can follow.
Chris, I really appreciate what you're saying, because for me, coming into this, I'm a 10-year Army veteran, and when I hear anarchist literature, when I hear somebody talk about anarchist leadership styles, I don't hear leadership. I hear like everything needs to be flat, there's no organizational structure, and so I appreciate that you're talking about a way for people to be in leadership but to empower others. I had a boss while I was in the Army, Eric Johnson, who just subconsciously did that, or maybe it was an overt thing for him, but for him it was always about whoever it was that was responsible for that area, or whoever it was that was doing that, or whoever it was that needed that experience, they needed to be the one to talk, they needed to be the one stepping forward, they needed to be the one gaining that experience and sharing what they brought to the table with everybody else, and not in a way that tried to make him the center of everything, but in a way that tried to make everybody's contributions matter. So I really appreciate you bringing that into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the downfalls, I think, of some of the the anarchist politics that are really out there, and that I talk about more in the book, is this idea that there are no leaders, or that we're just all equal, so that therefore no one should take initiative, no one should bring their own ideas, no one should have their own special talents. So this kind of idea that equality actually means that we're all fairly miserable, and we're all fairly no one's really doing anything because no one wants to hurt or oppress anyone else, and so it's a pretty sad situation of equality. So really trying to think about equality as this complex equality where, yes, we're trying to create democratic shared power, and there's a lot of different ways that we can be doing that. And so in some instances, I think that hierarchy can actually help facilitate democratic processes that can be very liberating, to help support people in mentoring relationships, or help give people specific roles and tasks that over time they can grow and become more empowered leaders and organizers themselves. And so again, but I think one of the goal of why are we trying to do what we're doing, what's the purpose, what's the reason behind our different structures, is absolutely key. Because you can have non-hierarchical consensus process where all kinds of inequalities are going undiscussed and really reinforced, and in fact can be harder to discuss if people are like, well, there is no leadership, and so what are you talking about when you're saying that I'm dominating the conversation?
Wow.
Yeah, we talked about that, I think, a little bit yesterday, Holly and Steve and I, about how if you remove any kind of responsibility for people to be engaged in making sure that the voices on the margins and those that aren't naturally going to dominate a conversation or naturally be heard, then if you remove all leadership, then you still end up marginalizing the people who didn't have a place at the table to begin with.
Right. Yeah. So again, looking to Ella Baker and other people, like how can we create intentional processes to support widespread leadership development that really helps give people skills, confidence, experiences, opportunities, and to see that as something that we need to really be intentionally doing, and also being then strategic about, well, who are getting those opportunities and really trying to prioritize, folks that have been historically marginalized from those opportunities, while also supporting the leadership of anti-racist white folks and feminist men as part of, again, trying to change this overall, the overall relationships of power.
But Chris, I wanted to just to go back to a question that you, or something that you raised in about one comment ago. You were talking about the need to develop leadership, and that really kind of reminded me of some of the training that we're doing right now. I'm a faith-rooted model of organizing training that was really, that term was really coined by Alexia Salvatierra, and it comes directly out of the movement that you're talking about, the civil rights movement, also out of Gandhi, and looking at what does it look like for us to actually raise up leadership or to organize from the roots of our faith. And the passage that comes to mind about exactly what you were talking about is the fact that we are all one body, and that the body has many parts, and that if the body feels like the thumb is more important than the knee, then if the body was all one big thumb, then how could we walk? But if it was all one big knee, how could we pick anything up? So, there's a need for us as organizers not to just think that organizing is just all about the front person with the face, or even about the back person who is not back but behind the scenes person who's kind of setting it all up and making it happen. But there are people in the body with spiritual gifts, all kinds of spiritual gifts. Some of those are gifts of administration, gifts of healing, gifts of prophecy, gifts of words of knowledge, all of those different, and I come from a charismatic background, can you tell?
I love it.
But all of those gifts have something to offer to the work of organizing, and they're all needed. In fact, one of the things that I had a moment once where we were in a legislator's office, and a person who had the total gift of prayer, like this is what this person knew this was her job because that's what she was really good at. She was praying that legislator over the line in that meeting, and there was a breakthrough. There was a true breakthrough in a moment where that breakthrough was needed, so prayer worked in that meeting. So anyway. That's
1 Corinthians 12, by the way, that you were referencing.
Yes. Amen.
This, Chris, one of the things that I'm really fascinated about, and we've kind of touched on a little bit here, is this sort of different understanding of anarchism. And one of the things that struck me about reading your book is how much you talk about love, and this idea of prefigurative politics, which this idea of living into a new reality that doesn't already exist yet sounds very kingdom theology to me, and the ways that it lines up is really fascinating to me. I wonder if you could say more about prefigurative politics and just sort of your understanding of anarchism. It's not, as I think Scott said in an earlier conversation, just burn everything down. That's actually an understanding of anarchism that you're trying to address with the book. That's not what anarchism is. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the goals of the book specifically around anarchism is less, okay, I'm trying to convince everyone to become an anarchist, and more of like, okay, a lot of us come from different traditions, different political traditions, spiritual traditions, and we have a lot that we can learn from one another. And so for myself, I'm not really interested in trying to get more and more people to go to anarchist-specific, events or demonstrations. I mean, that's great. I mean, I'm not trying to. But what I'm trying to say is that here's some useful ideas that I think are important to bring from the anarchist tradition and some experiences to bring into the larger conversation around how can we build a really vibrant, holistic, powerful left or social justice politics that can really meaningfully address the world that we live in now. A lot of anarchist politics, socialist politics were really developed, in the 1800s and in different conditions. And so, it's like, okay, what can we learn from these traditions? But what can we also? We need to be ready and and hungry to be learning from other traditions to create something new from what we can bring together. And so, with the prefigurative politics, I mean, that was one of the aspects of anarchism that really appealed to me. And it also really appealed when I learned more about radical Christian. A lot of the abolitionists, I mean, the Garrisonians, they talked about, they had their nonviolent resistance society in New England in the 1800s, where they were not only fighting against the abolition of slavery and against racial inequality, but they also started talking about living Christian values in the here and now. And that's always really appealed to me and to a lot of people who I think are alienated, feel this deep sense of alienation with a lot of what's going on culturally, with segregation, with consumer society, with different things that really disconnect us from the earth and from each other and from our histories and traditions. And so prefigurative politics is talking about how can we be both against things that, systems of oppression, but how can we also be for liberation? How can we also be for the values that we're working towards, and not just as some abstract concept of a future hereafter, or in this case a heaven, after we die, but how can we live our values and our politics to the extent that we can in the here and now, while also working against injustices in society. And so that includes how we, the ways that we can do that in our life. And it's not some prescription. It's not some sort of lifestyle of like, okay, well, that means that you have to shop in a certain way. You have to, raise your family in a certain way. You have to do, but it means that a lot of us are going to come up with really complex, nuanced, complicated. We're going to make lots of mistakes. We're going to have lots of successes. But trying to live our values in the here and now and build community and movement around those values that. Where it's not like, okay, sexism and racism, those are things that are going to happen after some sort of, idea of a revolution somewhere in the future, or there's going to be this revolution that happens, and we're going to deal with all these other things later. A lot of like early socialists and anarchists would talk about things like that. And so being like, okay, you know what, we actually need to work to transform our society in the here and now, while also working for systemic institutional change. But we also have a lot of power in our own lives to implement and create. So oftentimes, I try in the book to talk about, it's not just about winning structural reforms or winning new policy or winning, goes back to earlier, this question of everything being so centered around DC and, trying to win legislative battles on the national level. Yes, those are important fights. But we also have tremendous capacity to create, not just try to win reforms, but create new institutions, new relationships, new organizations that embody our values and our principles. But to not do that in a way that is either you're completely living your values or you're a hypocrite, because we have contradictions, we have complicated realities. And so to support one another to as much as possible, live our values and encourage one another, create institutions and organizations that try to live our values, recognizing there's going to be limitations, there's going to be mistakes. Not that makes us unaccountable for those mistakes, but to recognize that that's part of the process. And so why I talk about love so much is because we need to really have an ethic of love to help move us forward and carry us forward when things are really complicated and hard.
Mm-hmm.
That's rich, man.
I have if you don't mind, I have just one more question that came to me as you were talking about, actually earlier when you were talking. So you said something that struck me because it kind of relates to something I really was thinking about around the election season. Um, Jim Wallace just recently came back from his book tour, God's uh, on God's Side. And it's an exploration of the common good. And one of the things he found while he was on his book tour is how cynical the country is right now with regard to politics. I mean, really, really cynical. But not just politics, also about faith and about civil society, the ability of anybody to do anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so one of the big questions that's kind of out there, just hanging, is how do you organize in a situation where people are cynical about everything?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? About the capacity of us to do anything in this kind of a world where you have such polarized politics and a church that's also been deeply polarized in large part because of its politics. So I just wondered how would you answer that question?
Sorry, let me just interrupt one quick second. I'm just hearing that we have an echo. So maybe somebody's headset isn't plugged in. I just wanted to double check with you guys, or maybe somebody's got the YouTube open on their computer. But go ahead, Lisa Sharon.
Oh, I'm done. I'm just waiting for Cass.
Okay. Go, Chris.
Yeah, Michael Albert, who started up Z Magazine and was one of the founders of South End Press. He talked about how one of the tasks of the generation of the 60s was to really raise up the problems in society, to talk about segregation, to talk about Jim Crow apartheid, to talk about the Vietnam War, to talk about poverty, and to really highlight the problems in society. And that for a lot of people who were a part of movements in the 50s and 60s, this real sense that as more and more people became aware and more conscious of the problems, then people would come together to solve those problems. But as people worked for more and more change in the 60s and the 70s, a real cynicism developing about the ability to actually create change, and for us to not just replicate the same old problems with new solutions that create the same old problems. And so he said that the task for the generation today is to help people believe in our ability to change things, to help us believe in our ability to actually have meaningful relationships, to have vibrant community, to really be able to solve the tremendous, the environmental crisis, the economic crisis, the spiritual crisis of our world, that we as everyday people actually can and have historically been able to come together and make incredible changes that have been very beneficial. And so that one of the tasks, so I think a lot of times I know for myself as a young activist, I was really, trying to get everyone around me to see the horrors that, I had become aware of, and, passing out leaflets and, showing documentaries and getting people to go to demonstrations, to protest against things. But over time, it was this real sense of people being like, okay, well, we've done that and nothing's changed. I've been doing this activism now for 20 years and now it seems like things are actually worse. And so that I think that's where spirituality really has an important role to play to help us connect to a deeper purpose of doing political work, doing social justice work in a way that we're not only working, so for example, we're not only working to create some sort of legislative change at DC or even change local policy in New York City around environmental protection or
that's
environmental,
right.
But we're working to deepen our human community, our beloved community, as Dr. King talked about. We're building our beloved community in the process of working to address these problems. And so that's why I think prefigurative politics, and again, it doesn't have to be, it's not just anarchism, but I mean Dr. King talking about the beloved community. These are how we are working to embody our values and build our values into the ways that we organize, so that it can work against this cynicism of, well, you know what, we try to get a change on tar sands, or we try to get a change on mountaintop removal, or we try to get a change on a wide variety of issues, and it's not happening. And so deep cynicism about all kinds. I mean, the amount of insecurity, anxiety, alcohol and drug addiction, all kinds of different mental health issues that are so prevalent in our society. Again, I think that liberation politics and liberation spirituality has a huge role to play in helping people do something really meaningful and powerful that can help change things in their lives, their families, their communities, and in the world. But again, one of our roles is not to convince people that there's a whole lot of problems, because most people can give a long list of the problems and a long list of why we'll never be able to do anything about them. So I think our role, and I think your all's role as spiritual leaders, and for all of us, is to help increase the capacity for people to believe in our ability to change, and to help connect people to the history. I mean, we have an incredible history of liberation movements. I mean, we are living the victories of generations past who worked against racial segregation, who worked to create feminist policies and changes in the culture and in governance. We are living the victories of the labor movement. I mean, many of these things are also being eroded and worked against, but nonetheless, many young people today have no consciousness of the incredible victories that we live every day, that came as a result of everyday people saying, you know what, something needs to be done, and actually being able to make something positive happen. And so part of it is restoring historical connection and historical roots and connection to ancestors, as well as helping people believe that we can do something powerful today. And so just as an aside, pretty much every day that I would work on the book, I would start off by praying. I would start off by praying, and part of that prayer was praying and giving thanks to the ancestors who have come before me, who have taught me, the ancestors who I never met, but who I'm connected to through my mentors, through books, through stories, through whatever ways, connections to everyday people who I will never know their names, who made sacrifices, who have given their lives and raised their children to believe in these values that now I embrace. And so really trying to make a practice of connection and a practice of historical, the South Africans, again, they had a slogan about how revolution is a struggle of memory against forgetting. And so revolution being a struggle of our mind for our own historical understanding as a people of where we've been, what we can do, and what we're capable of accomplishing, so that we can work together for a different future.
Chris, I think that's awesome. I mean, that's what you were talking a lot about in your last part, but I think something that one of my friends from seminary, Lee Finnegan, brought to me in a book, and one of the things that I heard Lisa talk about at the Justice Conference was this deeper rooting in our faith, and recognizing that this is what we're called to be as a people, that we're in connection with other people, because other people are created by the same God that we believe in. But that as people of faith, we engage in this work knowing that God is at work in all that we do, and that in God we find our strength, and that we look back to Christ and all that Christ accomplished and all that Christ has called us to, and that Christ didn't just walk away from the situation and leave us here alone all by ourselves, but Christ gave us the Holy Spirit. It was Pentecost this past Sunday. It's hitting me. And
all right.
we're all talking, but we're all talking about all these struggles. And Chris Howson, who is an Anglican vicar and involved in the emergency Christianity movement over in the UK, talks about how activism needs to have the rooting that faith does. They need to look at people like Taizé, where they practice silence and reflection and contemplative prayer and all these things that you're talking about, in order to have the strength and the faith to endure through those setbacks and to believe in themselves that they have power. and power enough to change the world. So I appreciate you saying that. Amen.
Yeah. And I think that faith and spirituality can help us connect to what's beautiful and incredible and joyous about the world, and that it's not just about, you know, how terrible everything is and that, you know, there's problems everywhere you look. I mean, that there's a certain truth to that, but you just look around the world and look at people and look at nature and look at look at kids and look at, you know, just ways that people help and love one another. I mean, they're just unbelievable everyday examples of how beautiful our world is and what people are capable of. And so I think it's really important to also ground ourselves as people who are really taking on working against injustice, to also really do work to ground ourselves and connect to what is really beautiful and positive in the world around us. And it's not this either or thing of like everything is bad and we need to create something entirely new. I mean, there's a lot of really beautiful, powerful things from our traditions, from our cultures, that people practice today and historically that really embody the values that we have. And so I think spirituality again can also, and for me, I mean, social justice is a real spiritual practice, can help us have that deeper connection and see these things every day in our lives, so that we're not just developing this really, again, cynical view of, well, you know, humanity is just, you know, by nature, you know, has this evil or has this, like, you know, is just like committed to injustice on some deep level, you know, but that it's just incredible what people are capable of doing, both good and negative, but we need to connect to the good to help us believe that we can expand that.
Amen.
Amen.
I just want to jump in and say we're going to take, we've got about 10 more minutes because we ended up, with the technical difficulties at the beginning, we ended up starting about 15 minutes late. So we'll go till 10:45, and I'm just going to look and see one more time if folks on the live stream have any questions for us. I don't see anything coming in yet, but Chris, do you have any questions for us?
Well, I mean, I think, like, in what ways do you feel like you all are able to use, you know, I mean, there's been some references to you all being in a particular moment in your own evolution or your own growth as a faith. Like in what ways do you feel like this could be a moment of deeper transformation towards what you really want to be as a faith, and use this as an opportunity for growth? And this meaning is very vague and open to just more of like struggles, different kinds of struggles that are going on as a faith. Because again, I think, you know, one of the things I really try to focus on is we can often talk about the problems of, like, in our political work, in our organizations, but to really be focused on what are our strengths and what are the opportunities for us to live more fully our values and be more successful. So within this moment of difficulty or conflict, what opportunities do you all see to really move forward and live your values and be more effective in the world?
Chris, I'd like to respond to that. I think one of the things that really strikes me right now in terms of the moment that we're in, I actually really think you hit a real chord when you started talking about our spirituality. I think you kind of hit, in a lot of ways, the chord of where we are in this time, this Kairos moment. We've really begun to do faith-rooted organizing training as kind of the hub of our training curriculum at Sojourners. And I know there are several other groups out there, including CLU in California, and others that are also investing in and spreading the good news about faith-rooted organizing and the ways that we can actually organize from the roots of our faith. The thing that really just strikes me is that when we're out there doing that organizing, and also kind of referring back to Jim Wallace's experience on the road, people really do feel hopeless But I'll tell you what, when we come in and we actually kind of help folks to rediscover how it's the faith itself, it's the scripture, it's the words of Jesus, it's the words of the prophets that actually from the gospel actually move us into the public square and also move us into our own hearts. There's kind of a rediscovery of root faith that happens. Almost like I was just at an interfaith organizing training on Long Island, I think two weekends ago, 2 Saturdays ago, and I can't tell you how many of those folks actually came up to me afterwards and just said, wow, like I walked away from the faith, but for the first time I actually understand now, or I kind of want to come back. This is making me want to come back to the church, or want to read my Bible again. And I guess I'm really struck by, maybe we need to even go further with this. Maybe our organizing talk, at least for this moment, maybe in this Kairos moment, needs to really begin to focus even more on our own souls and the ways that our own souls have been depleted by so much disappointment over the last few decades. Disappointment in our faith, and even especially, I think, in the church.
Waiting for another question.
Was somebody in the queue?
I was wondering, Anthony, if you wouldn't mind answering Chris's question as it pertains to the emergent movement from your perspective.
Right. It's interesting that Lisa mentioned that Kairos moment, because I actually been meditating on that idea myself. This sort of God moment, or this opportune time, this time that's pregnant for giving birth to something very beautiful. I think we're at a moment where for me, and this is something I've really I got a lot of energy from in reading your text, is how you have placed the, interrogating white supremacy almost like a centerpiece into this conversation, in particular the work that you've been a part of. And I see that as is almost like within our movement, this particular issue has come full circle. It's like, it's here. This has to be dealt with. This has to be talked about. It can't be just sort of a side piece. But like the challenge is like that is a major block that needs to be placed in the center, where we begin to interrogate privilege on a very intentional level, just as much as we talk about epistemology, eschatology, the kingdom of God, which is a part of that. But I see that opportunity, for us to really intentionally do anti-racist training. And I saw a bit of this. You talk about prefigurative politics. I saw some prefigurative ecclesiology, if you will, or theology or church, just several weeks ago in Fort Worth. Me, Holly, and Steve were a part of Transform, and it was church leaders coming together to discern how we could do creative ways and innovative ways and justice-seeking ways to be the church in the world. And a component of that was a workshop that Holly and Steve led, which was anti-racist or anti-oppression work. They were doing a workshop on anti-oppression and unmasking privilege. And I believe there was some really exciting things that came out of that workshop, and I'm hoping that Holly and Steve can chime in on that. But that's the moment we seem to be pregnant for within this larger movement. Steve, do you want to add on, Holly?
I just personally feel like we need to have anti-oppression workshops at every gathering, wherever we're getting together,
right.
And talking about our faith and praxis and social justice movements. To me, the world that, that idea of prefigurative politics, that if we're living into that reality that we want to create, that we have to become the people who can live in that reality, right? And that racism is in all of us. We've grown up, been brought up in a racist culture, and so to me that's work, that's praxis, that's just something that we do. I have a great friend who's an amazing anti-racism trainer, and she's white, and she will get up and she will say, I've been doing anti-racism work for 30 years and I'm still a racist. And I just, think it's crazy how terrified people are of that word, and almost wonder if we need to kind of talk about who's a modern day racist. What does that person look like? What are they doing in their life? How does racism show up? Because it's all very subtle, at least for white folks who haven't done work around it. To them, I hear more over and over of it are just so huge and not subtle in my mind. So I think it's work that we need to do. So.
And Holly Roach will be leading a workshop on that at Wild Goose Festival.
Ooh.
The post hall.
Yeah.
There it is. And Holly has an announcement about our next open conversation. But do we have time for one more question? Because we did get a question from Kimberly Roth on the live stream for, I guess, for anyone who wants to try to answer this briefly. The question is someone's ability to believe in change connected to their own empowerment? As we create spaces to lead, are we also creating spaces to believe?
Man, could you read that again?
It's a great question. Is someone's ability to believe in change connected to their own empowerment? As we create spaces to lead, are we also creating spaces to believe? Or maybe we don't have an answer to that, and that is just a meditation to leave everyone with.
No, I think I'll say something briefly. I think as we create capacity to lead, we create space to believe. Right? So, leadership for some is a spiritual gift, and they literally, when they lead, you don't even need to teach them, they just lead, and you feel like you're being led by God, and it's a beautiful and empowering experience. But not everybody has that, and not everybody leads in the same way. And so as we develop leaders, as we pour in, and I honestly think that's one of the reasons why Jesus said, go and make disciples, not believers, but he said, make disciples. In other words, grow people up, teach them to lead, teach them to take the word and give it to others, and maybe teach them to take the word about the beloved community is what we would say in this context, and give it to others. But as we grow people's capacity to lead in the various ways that they're gifted to lead, then I think people, and make space for them to do that, then there is space to believe.
Thank you for that. Well, I think we're getting close to the end of our time. I just wanted to leave us with a thought about what it is we're doing here tonight, having this open conversation. This is a space that we've created and are inviting people to join into around conversations that we feel like we need to have as people of faith, living that out in practices, as people in conversation with one another, as people who are interested in building a movement together. It seems like we needed a place for us to have conversations like this, and also to look to some of our friends like Chris, who's been doing such incredible work and is such a wealth of knowledge and resources. So we want to create the invitation to folks that if you have something that you think is really burning and really important, for us as progressive Christians in this country to be looking at together. Please, chat us your ideas, and we are inviting people's participation and hope to explore these issues that are important, to us in this work in a way that's open and transparent. And this video will live on the internet for forever, as long as the internet is around. And we're hoping to be able to create a body of work that can be referenced as good, resources going forward and to aid all of our work. So thank you all for being here.
What's the next one going to be, Holly? What's the topic?
I believe that we're cooking up an open conversation in June on empire, and kind of the overriding question that we're using to put it together is there an inherent call to action in the social gospel and the story of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, when we live in the context of the empire that we live in today, living in the U.S. So.
And I think Trip Hudgens is going to be a part of that one. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, and Mark Van Steenwyk, I think.
Cool. I mentioned on the chat, but I didn't mention on the live stream, Christina Cleveland and Kimberly Knight were supposed to be with us, and they weren't able to be with us, but they will be with us on a future open conversation, or maybe multiple open conversations. We'll see. So stay tuned and look for news about that on the Sogo Facebook page, Twitter, etc. Thanks to everybody again for taking time out of your night tonight to be part of this conversation. Thank you so much, Chris, for for this book. This is a gift to all of us and your time tonight, and I look forward to keeping this conversation going. Scott, Lisa, Holly, Anthony, thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, y'all.
That's awesome.